I think one of the most important parts of the last sort of 72 hours was Prigozhin's video where he directly challenged the narrative for war that the Kremlin had put out, which was that Ukraine wasn't going to attack Russia, NATO wasn't going to attack Russia, and if there's a sort of lasting aftertaste of the events over the weekend, it's clearly that. That's important, that Russian people get to hear the truth, and that Prigozhin was able to do that. But I also think we shouldn't necessarily overcredit the sort of destabilization that somehow this is a massive derailment of the Kremlin. You know, what we see at the moment is Prigozhin's gone off to Belarus. The Wagner group is predominantly spent, done, dissipated, whichever you'd like to interpret it. And the war in Ukraine is still being prosecuted by the Russian General Staff. And as I sit here right now, General Gerasimov and Minister Shoigu are still doing their day job. And, you know, we shouldn't be that surprised. The Russian state has been designed like that for 300, 400 years to protect the Tsar. And there are questions. You could look as an outside observer about, you know, why did the FSB seem to take its time? Or was it slow? Or miss opportunities? Who knows? But also what led Prigozhin to decide that he could do this. I think the only big change is that he could do it. You know, I think it exposed that Russia's reserves are threadbare. The fact he could advance, or his small band of men, and I think it was only about 2,500 people, made it so far up the motorway without much opposition, sort of showed that how stretched Russians' reserves are. But it mustn't distract from the main mission, which is to support Ukraine in throwing Russia out of their country and the offensive that's going on at the moment.
Indeed, and that was a point mentioned by CGS earlier today as well, that this is an internal debate in Russia about how to wage the war better in Ukraine. But does it not confirm what the Ukrainians have always said, that if we are steady in our purpose, it would be the Russian regime that will crumble?
Look, CGS is right, though, on another thing, which is this is a Russian internal issue. It was clearly something, a matter for the Russian system and a matter for Russian generals and players of what happened over the weekend. I think the West overall looked at it with some surprise. And I think what we'd also probably say is that it was just another example of the cracks we have been seeing in public discourse, where an anger amongst generals. I mean, I can't remember how many generals have been fired or replaced in the last year and a plus by Russian leadership. If you remember early on, I think not a single one of the original sector or army commanders who started the invasion are still in place. I think they were all fired over this period. And then, of course, any army who suffers nearly 300,000 dead or casualties or desertions cannot expect to get away with reputational damage and indeed friction amongst its leadership about why and how, who's telling the truth, who's not. And you know, Prigozhin just articulated that as a free agent, as he probably saw it. So I think what we should really, go back to the beginning of my answer, we should take away from this is the most important thing he contributed was exposing the false Russian narrative for war.
Let me segue into something that probably will interest the audience much more and should be the sort of cue for your own questions. Next month, you'll be sort of marking 4 years in your position, the longest or sort of Secretary of State for Defense in the Conservative Party. In what way has the security environment changed and the way we respond to it in your stewardship over the last 4 years?
Well, I mean, I definitely feel that the world has got more anxious, more unstable, and more insecure. And at a global level, a whole load of forces have come together at the same time. The United States and China's sort of growing clash of both ideology, but also of competition and indeed sort of adversary type statuses. That's growing as China grows across the world, America, and the West's challenge to that is growing. Obviously, through things like the internet, the social media, over the years, we've seen more and more radicalization in places like Africa. That is definitely on the rise in different parts. And we've seen a Russia and a Russian leader transition from a man who I think used to belong to sort of the family, as they called it, under Yeltsin, the sort of liberals, who did spend quite a bit of time with the businesses and the oligarchs of Russia, transitioned to more and more wrapping himself in the Siloviki and developing a narrative to himself that is exposed in his essays, both on the end of the Second World War and then the later one on his view of Ukraine, a much more dangerous Russian leader and Russia itself. And all those combine to create a very unstable and anxious world. And the reason I say anxious is I think one thing the internet does is it spreads the fear very quickly. People feel more frightened in my constituency. You know, if a terrorist attack happened if you remember the Nice attacks, that dreadful attack, if you go back 20 years and an attack happened like that, it might have appeared on our newspaper front page maybe once. It might have been on the television, sort of number 3 in the television. But you know, my constituent Preston will be able to feel it and sense it and see it going round and round on the loop on the internet, and suddenly that level of insecurity or fear rises. So I think that's why how the armed forces does its business has to be threat-led. It has to be the intelligent application of our assets to meet those threats, both emerging threats and developed threats. And it has to be better coordinated in order to either work with partners, but also in order to communicate that not only do we have a plan, that we are following one to protect our citizens.